He didn't put her in a basement. He gave her the East Wing suite with a clawfoot tub, a fog-grey view of Lake Halcyon through reinforced glass, and a door that locked only from the outside. Stellan Farris thought 4 walls would rattle Audra Kells. He expected fear, the wide-eyed, white-knuckled kind that made people small and manageable. He expected her to go quiet, to eat the meals Hild brought without comment, to spend her days staring at the ceiling and waiting to be told what to do. What he didn't expect was to find her, 48 hours later, seated cross-legged on the floor of the East Wing suite in her stocking feet, his quarterly shipping manifests fanned out across the rug in meticulous rows, a red felt-tip pen tucked behind her ear, and a look on her face like she was cataloguing a library, not sitting in a locked room in the middle of someone else's war. She didn't look up when she heard the lock disengage. She just reached for her coffee. Audra had known what Farris Holdings was within her first 3 weeks on the job. The legitimate shipping operation was airtight on paper. Too airtight, the way only things that had been very deliberately constructed to look clean ever were. The subsidiary accounts in the Rotterdam filings didn't add up. The tonnage declarations were consistent in a way that tonnage declarations in actual shipping never were. Real cargo had variance. Real cargo had weather delays and spoilage and customs disputes. Farris Holdings had none of that. Farris Holdings had precision. She had flagged it in an internal memo to Soren, the CFO, 6 weeks ago. Soren had told her to mind her lane. She had started keeping a personal copy of every file she touched. Then, 11 days ago, the glass in the Midtown conference room had exploded inward. She remembered the weight of Stellan Farris's hand on her arm. Not a grip, not yet, just pressure, authoritative and immediate, and the way he moved through the chaos without flinching, like a man who had practiced this exact sequence of events before. He got her out. He got himself out. He drove north for 3.5 hours, with a satellite phone pressed to his ear, and the kind of silence in the car that had its own specific gravity. He brought her to the lake house. He walked her to the East Wing. He told her, without looking at her, that she would stay here until the situation was resolved. She had asked what situation, specifically. He had closed the door. She heard the lock engage. She stood in the center of the room for a long moment, listening to the fog settle over the lake outside. Then she went to inspect the bathroom. Stellan came on the 3rd evening. The lock clicked at just past 7. He stepped into the room and stopped. Audra was on the floor, surrounded by paper. She had organized it by account code, then by date, then by discrepancy flag, and the result was something that looked less like a guest suite and more like the war room of a particularly determined federal investigator. He looked at the paper, then at her. She looked up, no scramble to her feet, no visible alarm. "You have a leak in Rotterdam," she said. "But the Rotterdam numbers are just the symptom. Whoever set this up is pulling from the New Haven subsidiary, the wire pathway routes, through a shell account in Delaware before it ever touches the overseas transfer. It's been going on for approximately 14 months. Stellan stared at her. "I found your manifests in the filing cabinet," she added, nodding toward the mahogany cabinet in the corner. "The key was in the desk drawer. I assumed you didn't leave it there by accident." He hadn't. He'd left it there because he'd been moving too fast to think about it, and the oversight galled him now in a way that was difficult to articulate. "You've been in here for 72 hours, he said. "Yes." She picked up her coffee. "The water pressure is excellent for the record. The espresso machine works. I'd appreciate more paper if you're planning to keep me here another week. I've almost run through what I found." He looked at her for a long moment. The suit he was wearing was a day past pressed. There were shadows beneath his eyes that looked structural, like they'd been there so long they'd stopped being fatigue and started being architecture. He held a glass of something amber in his right hand, and he hadn't touched it yet. "You don't seem frightened," he said. "I was frightened on the drive up," Audra said. "I've since had 72 hours to recalibrate." He crossed the room slowly and crouched down to look at the papers on the floor. He didn't touch them. He just looked, and the way he did it, that still, analytical examination, told her something about how his mind worked. He was reading the system she'd built. He was understanding it. "The shell account in Delaware," he said. "2 layers deep from Soren's direct access codes," Audra said, "but the timing on the withdrawals corresponds to his travel schedule. He's not careful about his calendar." Stellan was quiet for a beat too long. "Soren has been with this organization for 9 years. "I know." She met his gaze. "And for 9 of those years, he's been skimming approximately 40,000 a month into an account that feeds back into a competing operation. I've got documentation if you want to see it." He stood up slowly. In the silence of the East Wing, with the fog pressing against the windows and the fire in the hearth doing most of the work to keep the cold out, Audra saw something she hadn't expected to see on Stellan Farris's face. Not anger, not relief even. Just the particular exhaustion of a man who has been betrayed so many times that the discovery of another betrayal lands less like a shock and more like a confirmation of something he already feared. "I'll look at the documentation," he said. He left without another word, the lock engaged behind him. Audra stared at the closed door for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. He came back the next evening with a laptop. He set it on the desk without ceremony, along with a leather folder of encrypted files and a printed access log. He said the machine was hardwired to the local secure server and that she shouldn't try anything clever. She told him she wasn't in the habit of doing things that weren't useful and asked him to pull up a chair. He did. It was profoundly strange, working side by side in the east wing of his lake house, while somewhere south of them his organization was quietly disintegrating. She walked him through the accounting trail methodically, the way she'd learned to present forensic findings to skeptical board members. Not with drama, but with logic, one link connecting to the next until the chain was undeniable. By the time she got to the 3rd layer of the shell structure, his shoulder was 6 inches from hers. She was aware of it the way you become aware of a sound that's been present for a while, gradually, and then all at once. "This is Soren's routing code," she said, tapping the screen. "Not a proxy, his direct code. He made one mistake. He used it on a holiday transfer because the backup processor was down and he couldn't mask it the usual way. That was 18 months ago. Every transfer since has had the same embedded signature. He just assumed no one would look that deep." Stellan leaned closer. The motion was purely functional, a better angle on the numbers, but it narrowed the already narrow space between them. She could smell him. Something clean and specific, cedar and cold air, the persistent scent of black coffee underneath. "Why didn't Soren catch that you'd found this?" he asked, his voice quiet in the room. "Because I flagged it to him as a routine discrepancy in the Rotterdam numbers," Audra said. "He looked at the top line, saw that it wasn't pointing at him directly, and told me to drop it. He thought I was incompetent." A beat of silence. "Most people look at me and assume incompetence," she said. "It wasn't self-pity. It was just a statement of observed fact. I've found it useful." Stellan turned his head then, just a few degrees, enough that they were nearly level. Up close, his eyes were darker than they looked from across a room. Brown gone nearly black, with a steadiness in them that came from years of deciding things and living with what those decisions cost. "I didn't," he said. She looked away first. He stood up, took the leather folder, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. "I'll have Hild bring you more paper tomorrow morning," he said. "Thank you." The lock engaged. Audra sat very still for a moment. Outside, the fog had lifted enough to show the surface of the lake, black and flat and perfectly still under a quarter moon. She went back to work. She didn't see him for 3 days after that. The meals came, the paper came. Hild brought everything without making eye contact, which Audra had stopped taking personally. The guards outside the window changed at 6-hour intervals, which told her Stellan was running a tighter rotation. Something had happened, or he thought something was about to. On the 4th night, the temperature dropped sharply. The fire had burned low, and she was half asleep on the settee when the lock clicked at just past 2 in the morning. Audra was on her feet before the door finished opening. Stellan stood in the frame. He was not wearing a jacket. His shirt, white dress weight, was soaked through on his left side with something dark. He took one step into the room. His knee buckled. He caught himself on the doorframe with one hand, sliding down it in a controlled, deliberate way that looked almost intentional until she realized it wasn't. She crossed the room in seconds. He was breathing in shallow, working pulls, his skin the specific grey of someone who'd lost more blood than the body negotiates with easily. He had his right hand pressed hard against his left side, and when she got close enough to see the damage, she understood why. Soren had contractors, he said without preamble. I got 2 of them, the third was faster. Don't talk. She dropped to her knees beside him. Let me see it. It's not. Move your hand. He moved his hand. It was a knife wound, not a bullet. Deep, jagged along the lower ribs, the kind of thing that bled more than it should without necessarily hitting anything immediately critical. She'd done 1 semester of nursing before she'd switched to accounting, and she had no idea why that information surfaced in her brain at this particular moment, but she held on to it. There's a first aid kit in the bathroom, she said. Can you walk? Yes. It took 6 agonizing minutes to get him there. She bore more of his weight than felt physically reasonable, and said nothing about it. The bathroom was marble, cold, and the overhead light was brutal in the way of spaces that had never needed to be gentle. She sat him on the edge of the tub. Under the sink, he said before she could ask. Far left. She found it. Heavy, military grade, the kind you didn't put in a guest bathroom unless you expected the guests to occasionally need one. She pulled out the iodine, the suture kit, the gauze. Take the shirt off, she told him. He tried. His left arm didn't cooperate. She took the trauma shears from the kit and cut the shirt up the back without asking permission. She peeled it away from the wound carefully, then got her first clear look at what she was working with. His back and torso were mapped with old damage, healed over lines that had once been cuts, the sunken marks of things that had gone in and been removed. She catalogued them the way she catalogued numbers, without reaction. This is going to hurt, she said, opening the iodine. I know. She poured it directly over the wound. Stellan's entire body went rigid. His right hand shot out and caught her hip, fingers pressing in hard enough to leave marks, and he rode it out in absolute silence. No sound, just the tension of a man holding himself together by force of will. She kept her hand steady against his side, applying pressure with the gauze, until the worst of the bleeding slowed. Talk to me, she said, threading the needle. Don't look at it. He lifted his gaze to her face. His eyes were fever-bright and entirely focused. Where did you work before Farris Holdings? He asked. His voice was controlled, deliberate. A mid-size forensic accounting firm in Newark, she said. Before that, bookkeeping for 3 different restaurants, a car dealership, and a family trust that turned out to be hiding assets from an ex-spouse. This is my first organized crime operation. Something moved across his face. It might have been amusement. She pushed the needle through. His breath fractured, his grip on her hip tightened. She kept her eyes on the suture and her hands steady and did not look up. Why do you stay calm? He asked through his teeth. Every situation, you just stay calm. I panic later, she said, on my own time. Stitch by stitch. The silence in the room was close and specific. Outside, the rain had started, a hard, slanting rain off the lake that hit the windows in irregular bursts. When she was on the 4th suture, he said, the house isn't secure. Soren's contractors, the ones who got away, they know this estate. How many of your people can you trust? Maybe 4, Gage. 2 others I'd bet on, a 4th I'm less certain about. Give me your phone, she said. When I'm done here, I'll call Gage. He was quiet for a moment. You don't know Gage. No, she agreed, but you're bleeding in a bathroom and someone has to make the call. Where is your phone? Left trouser pocket, a pause, Audra. She tied off the knot and looked up. His eyes were very steady, despite everything. "The door to the suite," he said. "It's unlocked. My guards are either down or scattered. I'm in no condition to stop you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she finished taping the gauze into place, wiped her hands on a clean cloth, and reached into his left trouser pocket for the phone. "Passcode," she said. He gave it to her. "Who's Gage in your contacts?" "Speed dial 3. She called. It rang twice. A man's voice answered, rough and alert for the hour. "It's Audra Kells," she said. "I'm Farris's auditor. He's been injured. The estate is compromised. Soren's contractors hit tonight. I need you here with a vetted crew, no one hired in the last 8 months. Come in from the North Service Road, not the main gate. I'll unlock the east perimeter remotely when you arrive." "How long?" A pause on the line. "Who the hell are you again?" "I'm the woman with administrative access to Farris Holdings' server, which currently controls this estate's security grid," Audra said, in the exact same tone she used when vendors tried to dispute her invoices. "I'm also the woman who can freeze every operational account in this organization before you make it to the county line. So I'll ask again, how long?" Another pause. Then, "Maybe 15. North Service Road," she repeated. "No headlights." She ended the call. Stellan was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. She couldn't fully name it. Something adjacent to bewilderment, but deeper. "You just threatened my top lieutenant," he said. "I implied a threat," she said. "There's a distinction. Get up. You need to be horizontal." Getting him to the bed took longer than the bathroom had. She covered the wound, got his legs elevated, and then sat at the desk with the laptop while he drifted in and out of something that was more collapse than sleep. She monitored the estate camera feeds. She found 3 external cameras that had been rotated off target, not by weather, but by someone who knew the angles and noted the timing. The breach had started 2 hours before Stellan had come back to the suite. He had fought his way here through his own estate. Gage arrived in 14 minutes. She unlocked the north perimeter from the laptop and watched on camera as 2 dark SUVs came up the service road without lights. The intercom from the hallway panel chimed. She crossed to the door that Stellan had confirmed was unlocked, that opened onto a clear path to the service stairs, and beyond that the drive and the county road and everything north of it, and opened it 6 inches. Gage was not what she'd expected, which was nothing specific, just not this. A man who was approximately her height but twice her width, with grey at his temples and a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, holding a tactical rifle with the casual ease of someone who'd carried one for decades. He looked at her with the particular expression men used when they were deciding how seriously to take her. She had catalogued that expression many times before. She knew exactly what to do with it. "He's stable," she said before Gage could speak. "Knifed wound to the left lower ribs, sutured and dressed. He's running a low fever, but his color is improving. He needs antibiotics and sleep, in that order." She paused. "Where is Soren?" Gage blinked. "We. Did your people pick up Soren?" "We have him contained," Gage said slowly. "Good. Don't move him until morning. No one goes near him except people you'd trust with your own finances, meaning people who have no upside from Soren surviving whatever conversation is coming." She met Gage's eyes. "Double the interior rotation. No one enters this wing without going through you personally. Do you have a medical bag in one of those vehicles?" "Yeah." "Bring it. Broad-spectrum antibiotics and an IV setup if you have one." Gage stared at her for a beat. Then he turned to the man behind him and gave the order without another word. She stepped back into the room. Behind her from the bed, Stellan said, "You didn't leave." She turned. He was awake, watching her from the pillows, his voice roughened by exhaustion and blood loss. "The North Service Road wasn't an option," she said. "I don't know the gate codes on the far side." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a lie," he said. It was. She walked to the desk and pulled the laptop closer. "Get some sleep, Farris." By morning, the estate's perimeter was locked down and Gage's people had swept the grounds. The fever broke just before 7. Stellan woke properly just after 8. He ate the breakfast Hild brought, all of it, which told Audra more about his recovery than any vital sign, and then he watched her reorganize the contact hierarchy on his satellite phone, which she'd decided needed doing, and said nothing about it. "There are 3 lieutenants who need to know what happened last night," she said, not looking up. "Walk me through them before any of them set foot in this room." "Why?" "Because you're in no shape to run a meeting, and someone will test that. If I know who's likely to push, I can be ready." She looked up. "Or you can handle it yourself." He told her about the 3. Hadley, who was sharp and would need to feel respected in order to cooperate. Greer, who was reliable but slow. And Thomas, who had been close to Soren for years and needed to be kept out of this conversation entirely. When Hadley arrived at 10, he came with Greer, which Audra had half expected. Hadley was a tall man with an expensive haircut, and the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. He looked at Stellan. He looked at Audra. He looked at Stellan again. "Who's running point?" he asked. "She is," Stellan said from the bed with the mild authority of a man pointing out an obvious fact. Hadley's jaw tightened very slightly, with respect. "I have Soren's complete accounting trail going back 14 months, Audra said. She opened the folder she'd prepared that morning and set it on the desk in front of him. "His extraction from your southern distribution network, not the one on the books, the real one, is on page 4. The payments to the contractors who hit this estate last night are on page 7. The holding account where he's been aggregating the total is page 11. Hadley looked at the folder, then at her. "Page 4, she said helpfully. He opened it. The room was quiet while he read. Beside him, Greer read over his shoulder, and she watched the color change in both of their faces. Not shock exactly, but the particular recalibration of men who were doing rapid math about what this meant for them personally. "Soren implicate anyone else?" Greer asked. "Not in the paperwork I've seen," Audra said. "Though I'd recommend a full independent audit before you rely on that conclusion." Hadley set the folder down slowly. He looked at Stellan. Something in his expression had shifted. Not deference, not exactly, but the specific adjustment men made when they stopped seeing a variable and started seeing a factor. "What do you need from us?" he asked. "The southern route rerouted through the Albany hub for 10 days while I certify the Soren-adjacent accounts are fully severed," Audra said. "Any payments to vendors that Soren personally authorized in the last 60 days held pending review, and full server access to the New Haven subsidiary by this afternoon." "Done," Hadley said. The second attack came at midnight. They found the camera blind spot she hadn't locked down tightly enough. The northeast angle, the one she'd missed because she'd been working from 3-year-old estate schematics and hadn't known about the access panel behind the woodshed. She heard the corridor window test before she saw anything, a soft considered pressure, someone taking inventory. Stellan. He was already awake. It went quickly, the way sudden violence always did, compressed into moments that felt both fast and crystalline, the kind of terrible clarity that arrives only when the stakes are high enough to burn off everything unnecessary. 2 men came through the corridor window. Gage's people took the first. The second got as far as the door of the east wing before Stellan dropped him. When Gage's voice came through the radio confirming the corridor was clear, Audra set down the fireplace poker she'd been holding without fully registering that she'd picked it up, and her hands began to shake. She pressed them flat against her thighs, breathed. Stellan crossed the room to her. He was pale from the exertion, his jaw tight, the wound clearly making its protest felt, but his eyes were steady in the way that they always were, the particular stillness of a man who had processed danger so many times it had stopped being noise. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't quite allowed himself to before. "You stayed," he said earlier with the door unlocked. "You stayed in the room." The North Road. Audra. She stopped. Why did you stay? The fire had burned low. Outside, the lake was dark and absolutely still in the aftermath of the rain, and the silence in the east wing had a texture to it, close and specific, the kind that made honesty feel less like a risk and more like the only thing left to say. Because you came here, she said. When you were hurt, with your whole estate around you, you came to this room. And the only reason that makes any sense is that you trusted me when you didn't trust anyone else. She held his gaze. I don't leave people who trust me. He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not urgently, not dramatically, just steadily, the way a man reaches for something he's been careful not to want for too long. I brought you here to protect my operation, he said. I know. I told myself that was the only reason. I know that too. He exhaled slowly. I was wrong on both counts. Somewhere below them she could hear Gage's crew moving through the ground floor, methodical and unhurried, cleaning up the way men like that did, with the same quiet professionalism she had always brought to a set of compromised accounts. Get back to bed, she said. You've reopened something. Probably. Farris. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something that had forgotten the shape of one and was trying to remember. He went back to the bed. She rewrapped his side, reapplied the gauze, pressed 2 antibiotics into his hand. He watched her work with the same quality of attention he brought to the financial files, comprehensive, unhurried, missing nothing. When she finished, she sat on the edge of the mattress. She meant to stand up again. She didn't. In the morning, he said quietly, I'm going to offer you a considerable amount of money and tell you that you can go. I know. And when I do, what are you going to say? She thought about Newark, about the accounting firm, about 6 years of making herself useful and forgettable, in rooms full of men who assumed both things automatically. She thought about the moment she'd looked at the Farris Holdings ledgers 6 weeks ago and understood exactly what she was looking at, and had kept going anyway. Because the numbers were interesting, because a problem like that one didn't come along often, because some part of her had been waiting, without knowing it, for something that asked everything she had. She looked at Stellan Farris, in the wreckage of the East Wing suite, with his old scars and his new sutures, and his eyes that watched her the way complicated things watched the only instrument calibrated to read them. I'm going to say I want a proper employment contract, she told him, with benefits, and full access to the New Haven books. I'm not finished with those. He was quiet, and she exhaled. And I'm going to say I'm already in this, she said. I've seen the ledgers. I've made the calls. I know the names. There's no version of walking out that puts me somewhere clean. She paused. But that's not the only reason. His hand found hers on the mattress. His thumb moved across her knuckles, slow and deliberate. No, he agreed, it's not. Outside, dawn was beginning to grey the far edge of the lake. The fog was coming back in, long and low across the water, the way it did every morning at this elevation, unhurried, inevitable, knowing exactly where it was going. She had arrived at this house as a liability to be managed until the situation resolved. She was leaving it as something else entirely, though leaving was no longer precisely the right word for what she intended. The ledgers were still on the desk. The accounts were still open on the screen. Farris Holdings, with all its legitimate surfaces and its carefully constructed depths, was waiting for someone to rebuild it from the inside. She already had a plan. She was, after all, very good with numbers, and Stellan Farris had just handed her the books.